This is Ken Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legend. The date is November the 18th, 1971. I'm interviewing Mr. T.E. Burch, B-U-R-C-H, of Wewoka, Oklahoma, who is president of the Security State Bank of Wewoka, a longtime resident of Wewoka. We'll be talking about his experiences and about those things that he recalls in Oklahoma, and particularly in the Wewoka area. Mr. Burch, I think to begin, why don't you tell us who your parents were, where they came from, and when you first came to Oklahoma, if you were not born here.
My parents was Mr. and Mrs. James Burch, and I was born at Agnes, Arkansas, that is Fulton County, Arkansas, July 24th, 1890. My first schooling was in that county at the school they call Possum Trot. It's now not a school anymore, but I go by to see the house when I go back there. I later moved to the western part of Fulton County near Wewoka, Arkansas, and was reared on the farm in that area, Salem being the county seat of Wewoka. I went to a country school called Oak Grove for many, many years, and then in 1908 I came to Stewart, Oklahoma, and I went to school there that year, and the next year I taught school in Pittsburgh County, not far from Stewart. I came back to school more, and the next year I taught in Hughes County, about 3 or 4 miles from Calvin, Oklahoma. Following that, I went to business college at Tecumseh, Oklahoma, to what used to be called the Old Indianola Business College. I went there in the spring of 1911, stayed in school there as a student and taught some until February 1912. I came to Wewoka because the school in Tecumseh had closed, and I came here looking for a bookkeeping job. I didn't know a single person in Wewoka. I went out from house to house looking for a job, and I believe the 3 banks at that time in Wewoka, I believe I went to 2 of the banks. They didn't need anyone. I went to the 3rd bank and simply introduced myself to the young man who I learned later was assistant cashier of that bank, and told him I was looking for a job. He told me that he was leaving in the next month, and that their president, Dr. Dixon from Oklahoma City, was there at that time for me to go back and see him. And he thought he would be interested in giving me a job. I did go back, met Mr. W.E. Dixon, who was an outstanding doctor in Oklahoma City at that time, and after discussing with him a little about my work and what I could do and bookkeeping and so on, he told me they needed a bookkeeper and a janitor and one who could feed cattle and horses, and I assured him that I could do that because I was raised on a farm. So with the approval of his brother, who was cashier of the bank, who was out of town at that time, Well, he gave me employment, and I saw his brother either that afternoon or the next morning and arranged to begin work in what was called the First Guarantee Bank of Wewoka. It had formerly been the First National Bank, but it changed to a state charter and called its name the First Guarantee Bank. I began there, and they never did let me feed any cattle or horses, but I did do the janitor work. And I worked during the remainder of 19 and 12 with the First Guarantee Bank in Wewoka as bookkeeper. They started me at a salary of $30 per month, but I believe toward the end of the year they got that up to $50.
Yes, let's talk about, swinging back a little bit, let's talk about the business school, what the business school was like at that time. You, of course, didn't have the business machines, obviously, that they have now that they use. So what was the business school like at Indianola?
The Indianola Business College was, they taught two things mainly. That was bookkeeping, and they had a very good system then. And then they had another department that taught shorthand and typing. Sorry to say, but I finally talked the teacher into giving me 100% on bookkeeping, but I never got that either on typing or on shorthand. I did learn to write shorthand and typing, and can still type a little bit yet.
What about the public schools here? What were they like? Could you describe them?
The public school here, I can't call the superintendent, but it was a small school. I believe the old building maybe is still standing here, but I'd say they had probably 10 or 15 teachers, as many as they had at that time, 1912, when I came here. And, of course, I never taught in school in Wewoka because I was in the bank and been in the banking business since that time.
What was Wewoka like when you first came here? Could you describe the town, kind of visualizing your mind's eye what that town was like at that time?
Wewoka is a small town. As I recall now, the population was 1,520 people. The Wewoka Trading Company was the main business house, I think, in Wewoka. There were other businesses here, a few, but the most of them were located on Wewoka Avenue from, near the depot to what is now called First Street. There was very little more business houses, just a little more on Wewoka Avenue, up to another block of what is now Second Street. There was no business, or very little of any kind, beyond Second Street on Wewoka Avenue at that time.
What about the streets? The streets of Wewoka at that time?
Streets of Wewoka, well, they were the streets that run now from 1 to 20 and up. They were then apple, peach, and cherry, and so on, and the various kind of names of fruits named all. And I remember being at the Chamber of Commerce meeting probably along in the late 20s or first 30s when Mr. Hugh Stokes of the Abstract Company decided that we ought to change the streets and have them run from 1 and up instead of apple, cherry, and oak, and so forth and so on. And they did, which made it much better.
Did they get muddy during the rainy season?
Yes, they were very muddy, and when the oil boom came here in 1923, I've seen
the wagons that were pulled by as many as 4 horses, maybe sometimes 6. I've seen them stuck on the main street, which is Wewoka Avenue at this time. It's very, very muddy, and when I came, there were only 3 cars here, and transportation was all by wagon or by foot and so on.
Who were some of the outstanding personalities of the earliest days of Wewoka when you were here?
Well, Mr. J.L. Dixon was he was the cashier of the First Guaranteed Bank where I worked, and I believe Mr. McConnell, I believe it was O.L. McConnell, who is cashier of the Farmers National Bank in Wewoka, located on the corner of what is now First Street and Wewoka Avenue. And then at the other bank, there was Mr. Roy Parmenter and Mr. C.E. Morgan, who Mr. Morgan was cashier and Mr. Parmenter was cashier. Then there's some stores. There was Mr. A.H. Taylor, who ran a general store that was located on Wewoka, north of, can't call the name of the street now, Cedar, I guess. North of Cedar on Wewoka Avenue. J.P. Stringfield, Jim Stringfield, they called him, operated a store at the corner of what is now Cedar and Wewoka. And I recall that that's where I left my suitcase when I came to Wewoka while I went out looking for a job.
You and Senator Al Nichols came here from Arkansas about the same time, isn't that right?
Yes, I think I beat Mr. Nichols here either a year or 2 years. He's from Arkansas, but I came here before he came. And I'd known Mr. Nichols, of course, very closely during the years. But I believe it was either 1913 or 1914 when he came.
What events that took place in Wewoka, say prior to World War, prior to 1920, do you feel were outstanding or memorable occasions as you remember? Maybe not as noteworthy events as they were interesting.
Well, I think the school meetings, and I believe they had basketball. They didn't have any football then at all, but that was the games. They had no Chamber of Commerce at that time, but occasionally they would have public meetings and discuss various things like we might do now at the Chamber of Commerce. But they did not have any Chamber of Commerce until the mid-1920s.
Do you recall any occasion that was a parade, a circus, or some outstanding national personality that came into Wewoka during the early days?
Yes, I remember about the 18 or 19 or 20s that some of the outstanding, one of the outstanding men that made several races, I believe, for President of the United States was on the train, and we all went down to hear him. His name right now, I can't say. Yes, William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was on the train, and I judged there were 400 or 500 or 600 people who went down to see him, and he came down on the steps from the train and spoke to us for about 15 or 20 minutes. It was a great occasion. That was about, I'd say, around the 19 or 20s, I think.
The World War I, how did this affect Wewoka?
Affected Wewoka quite a bit because it took a lot of the outstanding men out of town, and one was General W.S. Key, went out and returned, and another man that whose pictures on the out on the hall at WST, I can't call his name up. He died in World War I, an outstanding man, Wewoka. He had worked with his brother, two brothers, in running the Wewoka paper, which was a weekly paper. He was a very good friend of mine, and he was killed just in the latter part of World War I. His picture is now over in the hall in Wewoka building. I don't know what the... No, it's north of the South Dakota Civic Center. In the Wewoka Civic Center, this gentleman's picture is up there with General W.S.T., as they were two of the outstanding men. And not many more from Wewoka, as I recall, were killed, but a number went from Wewoka to World War I.
Tell us something about W.S.T. in his early days. This, of course, was before he had become so prominent statewide.
Yes. When I came here, Mr. T was running a store just across the street from the bank where I worked. Youngblood T Furniture Store. And that was before Mr. T was married. I recall a time or two that he came into the bank and he wanted to use our telephone, and he called who was later his wife and told her he was going out somewhere in a trip, and they bugged in and asked her to go with him. I remember that quite well. I remember, too, that just after I was married, that W.S.T. and his wife and some others came and sing out in the yard when wife and I had moved our first time to the first building.
Another thing I want to be sure we get as a matter of record, Mr. Haney was saying something about an indebtedness he had that dealt with baling some cotton. Can you tell about that? All right, thanks.
I might say this, that in my leaving the First Unity Bank, I will say that on the 31st day of January, 1912, it was a rather beautiful day. I was washing the windows outside the bank, and Mr. J.L. Dixon came to the door and told me I was wanted on telephone. I answered the telephone, and they told me it was R.W. Parmenter down at the Security State Bank. He wanted to see me. He wanted to see me right then. I went down, left my window washing, went down immediately. He called me back in the office and told me that they needed a man to work in the bank as a bookkeeper and perhaps janitor work too. They wanted me to begin the next day. And I told him that I'd promised Mr. Dixon that I'd stay another month and help to work in a young man that their new cashier was going to take there. And Mr. Dixon told me that Mr. Parmenter, told me that they didn't think Mr. Dixon should expect me to work. They had the job for me. They had it at the beginning of the month, and they had to have it the next day. I told them I'd be there, so I went back, and by the time I got back from lunch, and Mr. Dixon heard I was going down, and he asked me about it, and he said, all right. So I went down to that bank, and Mr. W.J. Bill Hanning was here in Farmer at that time, and I believe it was that fall that he came into the bank, and he said he'd made a bale or two bales of cotton. He had sold his cotton, and he wanted to pay off his note. And as I recall, it was about $50 or $60, and he gave me the money for the note. He wanted to pay it off, and he advised me that he had 50 cents left after paying it off. And I told Mr. Hanning that his note was few days past due, and I'd have to have that 50 cents. So I took his 50 cents, and he left without anything. And he's reminded me a number of times through the years of that. I didn't know about it for sure at the time.
He shouldn't have told you about that 50 cents, should he?
No.
If it had been 75 cents, he'd have probably got it.
Yeah, I probably would have got the 75 cents. But anyway, through the years, Mr. Haining and I have been very good friends. He's been an outstanding businessman since he quit farming and came to town, which is about 24, soon after the oil boom came here in 1923.
Thinking in terms of the 1920s, what events in Wewoka do you feel were outstanding then? Of course, the oil boom is one. Thinking around the oil boom, then we'll talk about it. Can you think of anything outside of that?
The farming at the first part of 1920 was very good, and the people raised cotton and corn and other feed material, and they had some cattle, and business was going pretty good. And then the oil boom did not come until 1923. And when that came, soon after that came, Mr. Parmenter, with whom I was working in the bank, got interested in the oil business, and he soon was making a good deal more money in that field than he was the oil business, so he told me that he'd look to me to take charge of the work in the bank, and he'd spend most of his time in the oil business. So he did and continued that until 1926, when we were arranging to move the bank from the corner of Cedar and Oak Fusky to where it is at this time, the corner of Wewoka Avenue and First Street. And he decided that he would sell the bank, and I got 5 or 6 men to work with me, and we bought out Mr. Dixon's interest in the bank, and we went along and moved on October 26, 1926 to the present location. Did quite well through the years. They offered to make me president that time, and I told them no, I didn't want to be, that I wanted Mr. W.L. Thurston, who is a member of our board and a very good friend of mine, to be the president of the bank. And he became president and was the president until he died, I believe, in 1941, perhaps. And at which time the board made me president after that.
Why don't you tell about a little of the excitement, confusion, whatever else there was during the oil boom? Obviously, there was a lot.
There was a lot of confusion. They didn't have a place in Wewoka to take care of the people. They stayed at various houses wherever they could. We had a family where we didn't need to use anyone else, but we used one and sometimes 2 rooms, was renting out to some family or a man and his wife. He was working here in the oil boom, and it was one of the most unusual things that I ever saw. They coming here, where they were up and down the street by the hundreds and maybe into the thousands, where they hadn't had been. During that, the oil boom came out at what is now Cromwell, was out in the farm area, and they began that little place, and I've seen that place when you couldn't walk through what is now the streets because there were too many people out there, and they had to stay wherever they could stay because many of them had tents and so on, and said that because there was a boom on that really meant a lot to this whole area.
How about the excitement of the Discovery well?
There was quite a bit of excitement to the Discovery well. Within a few, 2 or 3 hours after the first well was discovered, it was my pleasure to go out with another man from the Security State Bank, and we looked over. And the man who had drilled the well was walking about, and the oil was all over his hat, and he was very proud because he had an interest in the well, and he had spent several months drilling this well. And that was the beginning of the oil boom in Wewoka area, and it continued on and still boom here, but not like that. I'd say from 1923 to 1935 or maybe 40, it was really quite something in this area.
What about during the 1930s? What were the events of the 1930s worth me?
Well, to me, the worst event of 1930 was the tough time that came about 32. And one of our banks, the one that I'd worked with first, closed in 1924, a small bank. 1932, they closed the other bank, and we were the only bank for 5 years. And it was quite annoying, not interesting, but wondering what would happen next. And it was quite an unusual time, especially during that period of time when conditions financially were not what they had been from the beginning of the oil boom to 1932. That went out, of course, in 1933 and began to come normal again.
Can you think of any specific events that occurred, rather than in generalities, things, people who were here, or something like that during the 1930s? Any other outstanding things that occurred? How about in the 1940s, do you think of any?
Well, just the main thing is the growth that went on then, and the changes went on, beginning with the mid-20s and on up through the 30s and 40s. The buildings in Wewoka began to change, and they built a number of buildings where the Aldridge Hotel is at this time, which I believe was completed in 1927. There used to be a dairy barn there when I came there, and there were no buildings, I believe, between that and where the First National Bank is at this time, and there's a little one-story building there that had just on the outside of that building, and what was the old courthouse was a well out in the midst of the street that people brought their horses here, and they'd come to town, they'd come there and water the horses, and it was quite an outstanding place during those years.
You've been active in quite a number of things, in the Rotary Club and in church and many other things. Why don't you, I'm going to turn the tape over and we'll talk a few more minutes before, hold on. Mr. Burch, you've been active in a number of things in Wewoka. Why don't you tell us a few of those things that you feel have been the most interesting to you in those areas where you've played a role?
Well, I'd say one of the things is the Rotary Club. I'm one of the few members still living, was the charter member of the Rotary Club, which was organized here in 1925. And it's continued through the years. I've been active in that. I've been active in the Chamber of Commerce work through the years, served as president of the Chamber of Commerce 2 different times, a year each. I served as the president of the Wewoka Rotary Club. The second year of it was 27, I believe. And that with the Chamber of Commerce and other things have been quite active through the years. Now, if you'd like me to mention anything about that. Yes, the church here was with some help of mine outside here, was begun here in December 1913. The Church of Christ was organized here as a group of 13 people in 1913, December, just before Christmas, 1913. I was made an elder of the church, up on that occasion, and have served since that time as an elder of the church in Wewoka, and we have had considerable growth, and we bought the building from the Second Presbyterian Church that they rented to us at the time. We bought that in 1919, I believe, for the price of $1,200. We kept that building 10 years and sold it for $19,000 just 10 years later, and built a new building on what is now the corner of 4th and Mackasucky and Wewoka, and the church has continued to grow through the years, and at this time we have about 250 members, perhaps more, and we have buildings that cost us something more than $250,000 all told.
You think of anything I haven't asked that we ought to put on tape?
No, I don't think so. I've continued with a lot of interest to work with the Security State Bank, and this is my 59th year. I've continued with a lot of interest to work with the Security State Bank, and this is my 59th year with the Security State Bank, and two particular interests I have. One is in the bank with what it means to the community here, and the other is in my interest in the Church of Christ that I have been with since 1913.
Thank you very much. This has been an interview on November 18th, 1971 in Wewoka with Mr. T.E. Burch.